I know right now we're in the middle of discussions about whether we should take any actions in Syria because they use chemical weapons. Now, there is a little bit of hypocrisy here when the U.S. government talks about that because, of course, we know that our former ally, Iraq, used chemical weapons against Iran. But we just found out through some declassified documents that the CIA released and that were in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, that Foreign Policy did a great story on. Oops, we knew that they were going to use chemical weapons and apparently implicitly signed off on it. Now, I hear all the time from commentators like Joe Scarborough that, golly gee, people in the Middle East and Iran, etc., well, their hatred of us is irrational. In fact, go ahead, Joe, tell me why they hate us.
They hate us because they hate us. They hate us because they hate us. They hate us because they hate us. They hate us because they hate us.
Interesting. By the way, we did not repeat any of those. He said all of those things over and over again in one show. They hate us because they hate us. Now, the CIA has acknowledged, as well as two former presidents, or a current president and a former president, that in fact we did overthrow the democratically elected leader of Iran in 1953. And now we find out, oh yeah, we also knew that our ally Iraq at the time was using chemical weapons against Iran. They hate us because they hate us. So now let me give you the reality of this. Foreign Policy reports that these documents show that senior U.S. officials were being regularly informed about the scale of the nerve gas attacks. They are tantamount to an official American admission of complicity in some of the most gruesome chemical weapons attacks ever launched. Now, one of the people who was involved in this program is retired Air Force Colonel Rick Francona. What does he have to say? Quote, "The Iraqis never told us that they intended to use nerve gas. They didn't have to. We already knew." Now, he was the head of the intelligence that gathered information on where Iran had massed their forces. Now, that becomes very relevant in the story because you have to understand something. The Iraqis, in their very long war with Iran back in the 1980s, had been using chemical weapons for years. They started back in 1983-84. Certainly in 84, they had launched chemical weapons and we knew it. In 88, we get information from our aerial footage showing that Iran has found a hole in the Iraqi defenses near Basra and that they are going to take advantage of that and likely infiltrate Iraq, take Basra, and maybe decisively end the war. Now, we know that if we give information to the Iraqis, they will very likely use those chemical weapons to deflect that attack. Will we give them that information? Well, let's keep going and find out. Now, again, according to Foreign Policy, quote, "According to recently declassified CIA documents and interviews with former intelligence officials like Francona, the U.S. had firm evidence of Iraqi chemical attacks beginning in 1983. Now, here is an actual quote from the CIA documents. Quote, "If the Iraqis produce or acquire large new supplies of mustard agent, they almost certainly would use it against Iranian troops and towns near the border." So now Basra, of course, is in the situation that we're talking about here, where it's near the border. Iran has got their troops, they've moved them into place, and it looks like they're going to attack and be successful unless we tip off the Iraqis. Now, again, Foreign Policy explains. In the documents, the CIA said that Iran might not discover persuasive evidence of the weapon's use, even though the agency possessed it. So that's really interesting on two fronts. They're saying, we know the Iraqis use it, we're certain of it, but the Iranians don't necessarily have enough evidence. So this is one of the reasons stated for letting the Iraqis keep using chemical weapons. Because they're like, even though we know they're using it, Iran might never be able to prove it and bring it back to us, so it's okay. And then here was the second reason they had for letting the Iraqis continue to use chemical weapons. Quote, "Also, the agency noted that the Soviet Union had previously used chemical agents in Afghanistan and suffered few repercussions." In other words, hey, the Russians did it and they got away with it. So if our proxy, in this case Iraq, used it against Iran, well, sad day. Now remember, we just told you that they were using the chemical weapons and we knew it since 83, 84. Now the Basra attack is going to happen in early 1988. This goes all the way up to Ronald Reagan. Now his head of the CIA clearly knows about it. It's in the documents, right? But the decision goes up to Reagan. And they explained to him, look, it looks like Iran, if we don't tip off the Iraqis, are going to go through this hole in the defense and they could win the war. Now, we could do other things, but there are repercussions. Reagan writes in the notes of the memo, quote, an Iranian victory is unacceptable. Well, that would be about as clear as you can possibly imagine. Other things might be acceptable, but an Iranian victory is not acceptable. They hate us because they hate us. Guess what we did? We let the Iraqis know where the Iranian troops were. Guess what they did? They used sarin gas on them. One last quote. Officials were also warned that Iran might launch retaliatory attacks against U.S. interests in the Middle East, including terrorist strikes, if it believed the United States was complicit in Iraq's chemical warfare campaign. Well, it turns out we pretty much were. They pretty much knew. And we've had an enormous problem with Iran for decades after that, just like they thought we might. Well, we overthrew the democratically elected leader in a coup, and then we had Iraq launch sarin gas on them to make sure they did not win a devastating war that cost them untold number of lives. But they probably hate us just because they hate us. Wake up to the reality of what we've done. Look, you know, I'm a patriot, and I know that people get bothered by that. You know, when I talk about it, sometimes they accuse me of jingoism. I believe in the ideal of America. I believe in the idea of America. And I think that we can live up to those ideals. But oftentimes, we obviously have not. And it doesn't help the situation to bury your head in the sand and to say, anybody who admits that stuff is anti-American. No, we're pro-American. We're trying to get us to do better. And by the way, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't antagonize a country so much that they attacked us for decades on end, that we pushed them from a democracy to, by the way, being run by ayatollahs? Nice job, CIA. Well played. And then terrorist strikes for decades because we sanctioned Iran using Iraq gas on them. Does that seem to help American interests? Of course not. But remember this too, and this is really important. The CIA doesn't work for us. It doesn't work for the American people. It works for corporate interests. A lot of the people in the CIA wind up going into that same corporate field at the top levels. Now, some of the people that were in those top levels, especially in the decades past, would go into the CIA. I don't know if that revolving door functions as well in terms of, you know, corporate CEOs now going into the CIA. That's more of an old school thing. But certainly still CIA people get jobs outside in defense contractors, private contractors, and in other corporate fields. And so in Latin America, we want to overthrow a country because a banana company here in the US didn't like their policies on bananas. Done. We did that for a fucking banana company. Okay? And if Iran is not cooperating in handing over their oil to us, and by the way, when I say us, again, it's not us, the American people. We never get the oil. It's to contracts to so-called American companies, which are in fact, of course, multinational corporations. Well, then they're going to have a coup on their hands. And if they don't play ball, maybe we let our allies use sarin gas on them. You remember that famous picture of Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein shaking hands? You know why Rumsfeld was shaking his hand back then in the 1980s? Because he was selling him the weapons of mass destruction, and then they used on Iran. And then we then later, when Iraq, we felt crossed us, said, I can't believe you have weapons of mass destruction. I am just shocked. Shocked. I'm going to have to invade you because of it. Which, by the way, at that point, we knew they had gotten rid of because we also had the intelligence on that.